The story of the Trail of Tears is known to many, but most historical tragedies are whitewashed. So to speak, most of the teachings in schools are sugar-coated to be understandably child-friendly. But the story around the Trail of Tears is incredibly complicated. It involves a decade of build-up, dubious treaties, government legislation, Supreme Court cases, and more. It all comes together to paint a very clear picture of just how something so terrible was allowed to happen. How an estimated 13,000 people died due to starvation, diseases, and exposure from the elements. Here are 10 untold truths about the Trail of Tears. In 1843, a forced displacement policy sent thousands of Native Americans out of their homes and into unknown lands. The Trail of Tears is usually linked to the Cherokee tribe. It didn't only affect those in the south, but the north as well, affecting 88,000 natives. Most of them had to walk more than 1,000 miles on foot, resulting in an estimated 13,000 deaths relating to starvation, diseases, and exposure from the elements while en route to their newly designated Indian Reserve. But historians believe there to be more unaccounted deaths. The forced relocations led to a decade-long war with the Seminole tribe in Florida. The forced relocation affected over 20 native tribes. Tribes in the north were mainly forced to Kansas. 5 main southern tribes were sent to Indian lands currently known today as Oklahoma. Most tribes also owned slaves, and so the relocation affected the slaved members as well. The Choctaw, Creek, Chickasaw, Seminoles, and Cherokee tribes each had devastation occur to their tribes during their forced relocation with their own Trail of Tears stories. The northern part of Georgia had been set aside for the Cherokee Nation, but in 1829, when a ton of gold was found on Indian territory, prospectors poured into the area by thousands, trespassing, eager to make it rich. The Native Americans were treated harshly and treated like they were the ones that shouldn't be there. America and its states were growing at a rapid rate, looking for land to own to create new states. Many land agreements stated that if a native tribe sold part of their land, then they would be able to keep the rest of it. But of course, a deal which rarely followed through. Furthermore, the government then thought it would be even more enticing to offer the natives land in other unoccupied states in exchange for their land, leading many Americans to believe that Native Americans were now on American settlers' land. This belief was heavily influenced by the government and its policies. When Andrew Jackson was elected president in 1829, the same year gold was found on Cherokee Indian Territory in Georgia, he made sure removing natives was a priority and signed the Indian Removal Act in 1830 to remove the Native Americans off their land that they had lived on for generations. Andrew Jackson wasn't fond of the Native Americans and had a major role in the Trail of Tears. He had already taken Florida and parts of Alabama and Georgia. It is believed he detested the Native Americans due to losing his brother fighting against the British during the Revolutionary War. The natives had treaties and worked alongside the British. This, although, didn't stop him from asking for aid from the Choctaw tribe during the War of 1812. Andrew Jackson stated the Indian Removal Act was for the natives' own good. The Removal Act was stated that it was strictly voluntary and both parties would need to be in agreement to the relocation with equal or more amounts of land elsewhere in exchange, as well as many other benefits including relocation assistance from the government. As many of the tribes had been on the land for generations and had lives already built, most chose to decline the relocation offer. Andrew Jackson signed a deal with the Choctaw tribe in 1831 and relocated them from Mississippi to Oklahoma. The Choctaw tribe made their journey on foot with no food or supplies and without any assistance from the government. Thousands of people died along the way. The Choctaw leader told the newspaper it was Trail of Tears and Death, which explains the origins for the name as it is known today. Even though they had originally had a good relationship with the white government, they were still betrayed and left to fend for themselves. By 1832, the Creeks and Chickasaw had to give up their land as well and relocate. After the United States achieved independence, the Seminoles tribe expanded considerably and was further supplemented by escaped slaves from southern plantations who settled near and paid tribute to Seminole towns. Settlers in Georgia increased pressure on Seminole lands, and this led to the First Seminole War of 1816. The United States purchased Florida from Spain and took possession in 1821. The Seminoles were moved out of their farmland in northern Florida and confined to a large reservation in the interior of Florida. The 1830 Indian Removal Act called for the relocation again of all Seminoles to Indian Territory. Many resisted, leading to the Second Seminole War, the bloodiest war against Native Americans in the United States history. Escaped slaves willingly fought by the side of Seminoles. However, by 1842, most Seminoles and African Seminoles facing starvation were removed to Indian Territory west of the Mississippi River. Many of the natives opposed to their removal and tried to resist. Some moved peacefully and a few were able to stay in their original state. After hearing the way the people of the Choctaw tribe were treated during their journey, other tribes couldn't put their faith into the government and were more insistent at opposing the Relocation Act. During the time of the Indian Removal Act, another law was passed that stated any gold found on Georgia land was the property of Georgia, even if it was on Cherokee land. With the Cherokee refusing to leave their homes, this aggravated those wanting to purchase land to prospect for gold. The Cherokees filed a complaint with the Supreme Court, and later the Supreme Court told Andrew Jackson that it would be unlawful for white settlers to kick the Cherokees off their land due to previous holding treaties. This did not sit well with Andrew Jackson. He then decided to go against the Supreme Court and sign trade deals with a few Cherokee members that had no right to decide anything about Cherokee lands. The Cherokees and their leader, John Ross, were fully against the relocation. They protested the unlawful treaty that was signed, but it was ignored by the government. Martin van Buren took over the presidency in 1837 and sent troops to the Cherokee Nation to arrest and remove the Cherokees by force. Soldiers were told to swarm Cherokee houses without warning, giving the Indians no time to put up a fight or even pack their belongings. With this, as soon as Cherokees were removed, white settlers moved in, looted, and took everything they owned, including their homes. The unwilling Cherokees were rounded up and put into prison camps, which were basically concentration camps, until they could be moved to their reservation in Oklahoma. These small camps held hundreds of Cherokees at a time, which became dangerously overcrowded, resulting in people dying every day from disease, malnutrition, and dehydration. The roundup took over 5 months to complete, which took much longer than expected. Approximately 1/3 of the deaths attributed to the Cherokee Trail of Tears as a result of these camps. Many of these diseased camps have been lost from the history books. When they were eventually force-marched some 1,200 miles, most of them were too weak and had to endure walking through snow in the middle of winter. 2,000 people died in the camps even before they started on their forced death march. One soldier who guarded the forts would later write, "During the Civil War, I watched as hundreds of men died, including my own brother, but none of that compares to what we did to the Cherokee Indians." Most people think that malnutrition, dehydration, and fatigue were the worst conditions on the trail, but those conditions were nothing compared to the violation and murders that took place. As if the natives didn't already have inadequate food, clothes, and blankets, the guards at the forts stole what little they did have with them. Many also repeatedly violated women and children. Many tribes were treated brutally on the trails. Mary Tustanugi Tiger, a Seminole woman, told how she and her eldest daughter were violated and used for the soldiers' pleasure on their journey to the new Indian Territory. Her daughter got so badly injured that she had to carry her. Other young women experienced the same on the trail as well, and she recalls how some of the people, mainly the elderly, would be weak from malnutrition and exhaustion. They were driven like cows on the trail, and if they would fall, they would be whipped. If they did not continue walking, then the soldiers would shoot them. Mary also claimed that babies would be thrown into lakes should they become an inconvenience. A Upon arrival to Oklahoma, much of the land promised in the treaties that the government used to convince natives to move was taken away, and the land that they did get was unsettled open land, which meant they were deserted and had to start from the beginning. They had to rebuild homes, schools, and farms, which took years. They also had to begin anew after many lost their loved ones, some losing entire families. About 4,000 people died during their forced journey to Indian Territory, and all in all about 6,000 Cherokees alone died as a result to the camps and death march. Andrew Jackson has been labeled as a great war hero, and he is celebrated with his face on the $20 American note. Just after 2 decades in their new home, the Civil War divided Native American lands and led to border disputes in their territories. After 1866, cattle trails and cattle ranches developed as cowboys either drove their product north or settled illegally in Indian Territory. In 1881, 4 out of 5 major cattle trails on the western frontier traveled directly through Indian Territory. There was increased presence of white settlers in Indian territories, and in 1887, the US passed an act stating they had to purchase the land that was given to them by the government, even though it was forced traded years ago. This act divided the lands of individual tribes into allotments for individual families, encouraging farming and private land ownership amongst Native Americans, but expropriating land to the federal government as well. In the process, railroad companies took nearly half of Indian-held land within the territory for outside settlers. Then oil was discovered in the area, and everyone started flooding into their land to get their hands on the oil, which was the second best thing after gold. In 1907, the Indian Territory officially became the state known today as Oklahoma. After the natives had just endured the cruelty of being forced from their lands in the Trail of Tears, news of Ireland's potato famine reached several American Indian communities in the United States during the winter of 1847. The Cherokee and Choctaw nations were the first to act, and both tribes managed to gather $800 to send aid to the Irish, knowing firsthand what it was like to starve. About 2 million Irish perished in the Irish famine. Thank you so much for watching, and please subscribe. And if you would like to know more on the Irish famine, click on the link in the description below.